Picture this. You're shivering in your apartment because the heating bill is too high, ordering takeout because you can't be bothered to cook, and wondering how your ancestors survived without Netflix to distract them from the cold. Meanwhile, 40,000 years ago, a group of humans in fur-lined shelters were not just surviving, but absolutely thriving through ice ages that would make our worst winters look like a mild autumn day. This isn't just another survival story. This is the untold chapter of human resilience that completely flips everything you think you know about our so-called primitive ancestors. Because while we're struggling to function when the Wi-Fi goes out for 10 minutes, these people were engineering solutions, building communities, and creating art during climate conditions that would shut down modern civilization. So whether you're here because you're fascinated by human history, you're prepping for the next power outage, or you're just tired of feeling helpless every time the temperature drops below freezing, you're in the right place. I'm about to walk you through the most incredible winter survival strategies ever developed by the human species. And trust me, by the end of this, you'll never look at winter the same way again. But first, let me set the scene. Because this isn't just about being cold. This is about surviving in a world that was actively trying to kill you. Imagine waking up to temperatures that regularly hit -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Not for a day, not for a week, but for months at a time. The kind of cold where your breath doesn't just fog up, it crystallizes instantly. Where exposed skin freezes in minutes, where the very air feels like it's burning your lungs. Now imagine there's no heated shelter waiting for you. No grocery store down the street. No emergency services if something goes wrong. No fleece jackets, no down comforters, no hot chocolate. Just you, your family, and a landscape that stretches endlessly in every direction, covered in snow and ice, populated by creatures that could tear you apart without breaking a sweat. This was the reality for our ancestors during the last glacial maximum, roughly 20,000 years ago. But here's the thing that blows my mind. They didn't just survive this, they flourished. They spread across continents. They developed technologies that wouldn't be seen again for thousands of years. They created art that still takes our breath away today. How is that even possible? The answer lies in something most people completely misunderstand about our ancestors. We've been fed this image of cavemen as brutish, barely intelligent creatures who stumbled through life on instinct alone. But the archaeological evidence tells a completely different story. These people were sophisticated engineers, master psychologists, and survival experts whose innovations were so effective that some of them are still used today. Take the Gravettian culture, for example. These folks lived across Europe during some of the harshest conditions our planet has seen in the last 100,000 years. While glaciers the size of entire countries crept down from the north, while mammoths and woolly rhinoceros roamed the frozen steppes, these humans were building permanent settlements, creating intricate tools, and developing social systems that kept entire communities alive through winters that lasted half the year. Or consider the people who lived in what's now Siberia during the height of the Ice Age. Not only did they survive in one of the most hostile environments on Earth, but they were also creating some of the most sophisticated clothing ever made. We're talking about tailored garments with multiple layers, specialized footwear, and weatherproofing techniques that modern outdoor gear companies are still trying to replicate. But here's where it gets really interesting. Their success wasn't just about having the right tools or techniques. It was about understanding something fundamental about human nature that we've somehow forgotten in our modern world. You see, when most people think about survival, they focus on the physical challenges. How do you stay warm? How do you find food? How do you avoid predators? And yes, these things matter. But our ancestors figured out something crucial. The biggest threat to survival isn't the cold or the hunger or even the predators. It's the psychological collapse that happens when people lose hope, when they stop working together, when they give up. The archaeological record shows us communities that not only survived, but maintained complex social structures, artistic traditions, and cultural practices throughout the worst climatic conditions in human history. These weren't desperate people, just barely clinging to life. These were societies that had figured out how to thrive in the midst of chaos. And that's what makes their story so relevant today. Because while we might not be facing saber-toothed tigers or woolly mammoths, we're dealing with our own forms of uncertainty, our own harsh winters, whether they're economic, social, or environmental. The principles that kept our ancestors alive and thriving 40,000 years ago are the same principles that can help us navigate whatever challenges we're facing now. So how did they do it? How did people with no modern technology, no industrial infrastructure, no global supply chains, manage to not just survive, but build thriving communities in conditions that would challenge even our most advanced survival experts today? The answer comes down to 3 core strategies that work together like a perfectly orchestrated symphony. First, they mastered the art of preparation in ways that would put modern preppers to shame. Second, they developed community systems that ensured no one faced the winter alone. And third, they understood how to maintain psychological resilience when everything around them was trying to break their spirit. But before we dive into these strategies, I need to address something that might be bothering you. You might be thinking, okay, but these people had much shorter lifespans. They might have survived winters, but they were dying young from all sorts of other causes. And you're partially right. Life expectancy was lower. But here's the thing. When archaeologists study the remains of people who lived through these Ice Age winters, they're not finding evidence of mass starvation or widespread death from exposure. They're finding evidence of people who lived full, active lives well into their senior years. The Gravettian burial sites, for instance, show individuals who lived to be 60, 70, even 80 years old. These weren't just the lucky few. These were people who had figured out systems so effective that aging naturally was more common than dying from environmental causes. And that brings us to the first major strategy: preparation that went far beyond just stockpiling food. When we think about winter preparation today, we might buy some extra canned goods, make sure we have batteries for our flashlights, maybe get our car winterized. Our ancestors took a completely different approach. They didn't just prepare for winter. They designed their entire lives around the reality of winter. This started with their understanding of seasonal cycles that was so sophisticated it bordered on the mystical. They didn't just know that winter was coming. They knew exactly when it would arrive, how long it would last, and what specific challenges each phase would bring. They tracked weather patterns, animal migrations, and plant cycles with a precision that allowed them to anticipate changes weeks or even months in advance. But knowledge alone wasn't enough. They translated this understanding into actions that seem almost impossibly complex when you consider they were doing this without computers, without weather satellites, without any of the tools we rely on today. Take food preservation, for example. We know from archaeological evidence that these communities were processing and storing massive quantities of food during the brief summer months. But this wasn't just about drying meat or collecting nuts. They were using techniques like fermentation, smoking, and fat-based preservation that created foods with shelf lives measured in years, not months. At sites like Dolní Věstonice, in what's now the Czech Republic, archaeologists have found evidence of sophisticated food processing operations that could handle entire herds of mammoth reindeer and other large game. These weren't just hunting camps. They were like prehistoric food processing plants with specialized areas for butchering, smoking, fat rendering, and long-term storage. But here's where it gets really impressive. They weren't just preserving food randomly. They were creating carefully balanced nutritional profiles that would sustain them through the entire winter. They understood that surviving months of extreme cold required not just calories, but specific combinations of proteins, fats, and micronutrients that would keep their bodies functioning at peak efficiency. The fat content alone is mind-blowing. Modern nutritionists are just starting to understand how crucial healthy fats are for cold weather survival. But our ancestors had this figured out tens of thousands of years ago. They were deliberately targeting the fattest animals, processing and storing massive quantities of rendered fat, and incorporating it into their preserved foods at ratios that would optimize their metabolism for cold weather conditions. And this is just the beginning. The preparation strategies they developed went far beyond food into areas that most modern survival experts never even consider. They were engineering their living spaces with a level of sophistication that would make modern architects jealous. These weren't crude caves or hastily thrown together shelters. We're talking about complex multi-room structures designed with advanced understanding of thermodynamics, air circulation, and psychological comfort. At sites like Mezrich in Ukraine, archaeologists have uncovered homes built entirely from mammoth bones. Not just random piles of bones, but carefully engineered structures where every single bone was selected for its specific structural properties. The foundation bones were chosen for their load-bearing capacity. The wall bones were selected for their interlocking capabilities. The roof bones were picked for their ability to shed water and snow. These houses weren't just functional, they were comfortable. The floors were lined with carefully prepared hides and furs, creating insulation systems that could maintain interior temperatures 30 to 40 degrees warmer than the outside air. They had designated sleeping areas, cooking areas, tool-making areas, and even what appeared to be social gathering spaces. But here's what really gets me. They were building these structures to last. Not just for one winter, but for generations. Some of these mammoth bone houses show evidence of continuous occupation for decades, with repairs, modifications, and improvements being made over time. These people weren't just surviving winter. They were building permanent communities designed to thrive through repeated ice age cycles. The heating systems alone would impress modern engineers. They weren't just building fires in the middle of their shelters and hoping for the best. They were creating sophisticated ventilation systems that could circulate warm air throughout their living spaces while preventing smoke buildup. They were using thermal mass principles, storing heat in stones during the day and releasing it slowly throughout the night. And the fuel efficiency, absolutely incredible. They were getting maximum heat output from minimal fuel input, using techniques that modern survival experts are still trying to reverse engineer. They understood how different types of wood burned at different temperatures, how to create coal-like substances from organic materials, and how to maintain fires for days with minimal attention. But preparation wasn't just about the physical infrastructure. They were also preparing psychologically in ways that reveal a deep understanding of human nature that we've somehow lost in our modern world. These communities developed elaborate ritual systems, specifically designed to help people cope with the psychological challenges of winter. They weren't just random ceremonies. They were carefully crafted experiences that served specific psychological functions. Some rituals were designed to maintain group cohesion during the long months of isolation. Others were focused on individual resilience, helping people maintain their sense of purpose and identity when the external world became hostile and unpredictable. The cave paintings we find from this period aren't just art, they're psychological tools. These images served as focal points for meditation, storytelling, and community bonding during the darkest months of the year. They were creating shared mythologies that gave meaning to their suffering and hope for the future. And this brings us to the second major strategy: community systems that ensured no one faced winter alone. Modern survival culture is obsessed with the lone wolf mentality. The idea that true survival means being completely self-reliant, needing no one, depending on nothing but your own skills and resources. Our ancestors would have laughed at this concept, not because they were weak, but because they understood something fundamental about human survival that we've forgotten. Cooperation isn't just helpful, it's essential. The social structures they developed weren't just about sharing resources, though that was certainly part of it. They were creating sophisticated systems of mutual support that addressed every aspect of winter survival, from the practical to the psychological. Take food sharing, for example. They weren't just pooling their resources randomly. They were creating complex distribution systems that ensured everyone had access to the specific nutrients they needed to maintain their health throughout the winter. Pregnant women got priority access to certain foods. Children got specialized nutrition. Elderly people got foods that were easier to digest. Hunters got high-energy foods that would sustain them during difficult expeditions. But it went deeper than just food distribution. They were creating knowledge-sharing systems that ensured critical survival information was preserved and transmitted, even if key individuals were lost. If the best tracker in the group died, there were backup trackers who had been trained in the same techniques. If the master toolmaker was injured, there were apprentices ready to take over. They were building redundancy into their survival systems at every level. The psychological support systems they developed were equally sophisticated. They understood that winter isolation could drive people to despair, depression, and even madness. So they created social rituals, specifically designed to combat these tendencies. Group storytelling sessions that lasted for hours, keeping people engaged and connected. Collaborative work projects that gave everyone a sense of purpose and accomplishment. Games and competitions that maintained morale and physical fitness. They were also incredibly strategic about how they structured their communities. These weren't just random collections of families thrown together by circumstance. They were carefully balanced groups that included people with complementary skills, personalities, and social roles. They understood that a successful winter community needed not just hunters and gatherers, but also entertainers, mediators, spiritual leaders, and caretakers. And here's something that might surprise you. They were actively managing conflict resolution in ways that would impress modern psychologists. Winter isolation can intensify interpersonal tensions, turning minor disagreements into community-threatening disputes. Our ancestors developed sophisticated systems for preventing, managing, and resolving conflicts before they could destabilize the group. They had designated mediators, formal processes for addressing grievances, and even ritualized ways of expressing anger and frustration that didn't threaten group cohesion. They understood that maintaining social harmony wasn't just about being nice to each other. It was a survival necessity. The archaeological evidence shows us communities that maintained stable social structures throughout winters that lasted 6 months or more. That's not just impressive, it's almost miraculous when you consider how challenging it can be to maintain group harmony in much easier circumstances. But perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of their community systems was how they dealt with the reality that not everyone could contribute equally all the time. They understood that people got sick, injured, or simply wore out. Instead of abandoning these individuals, they created support systems that kept them integrated into the community in meaningful ways. Elderly people, who could no longer hunt or gather, became the keepers of knowledge, the storytellers, the spiritual guides. Injured hunters became toolmakers or teachers. People with disabilities were given roles that matched their abilities while still contributing to the group's survival. This wasn't charity, it was strategic. They understood that diversity of experience and perspective made their communities stronger and more resilient. They were creating inclusive systems not out of moral obligation, but out of practical necessity. And this leads us to the third, and perhaps most important strategy: psychological resilience that allowed them to maintain hope and purpose even when everything around them was trying to break their spirit. This is where our ancestors really separated themselves from every other species on the planet. Other animals might have better physical adaptations for cold weather, but humans developed something unique: the ability to find meaning and purpose in suffering itself. The evidence for this is everywhere in the archaeological record. These people weren't just surviving, they were creating. Some of the most beautiful art in human history was created during the worst climatic conditions our species has ever faced. They were carving intricate figurines, painting elaborate cave murals, and crafting decorative objects that served no practical survival function. This wasn't frivolous behavior. This was psychological engineering at its finest. They understood that hope isn't just a feeling, it's a survival tool. And they were deliberately cultivating hope through creative expression, spiritual practice, and community celebration. The ritual systems they developed were incredibly sophisticated from a psychological perspective. They weren't just random ceremonies. They were carefully designed experiences that served specific mental health functions. Some rituals were designed to process grief and loss. Others were focused on maintaining group identity and purpose. Still others were about celebrating small victories and maintaining morale during the darkest times. They were also master storytellers, creating complex mythologies that helped people make sense of their suffering and maintain hope for the future. These weren't just entertainment. They were psychological tools that helped people maintain their sanity and purpose during months of isolation and hardship. But perhaps most importantly, they understood something about human nature that we've somehow forgotten. People can endure almost anything if they believe their suffering has meaning and purpose. They weren't just telling themselves that winter would end eventually. They were creating elaborate belief systems that transformed their suffering into something sacred, something necessary, something that connected them to forces larger than themselves. The frozen landscape wasn't just an obstacle to overcome. It was a testing ground that would prove their worthiness, strengthen their bonds, and prepare them for whatever challenges lay ahead. The archaeological evidence shows us communities that maintained not just their physical health, but their spiritual and emotional well-being throughout winters that would have broken most modern people within weeks. They were practicing what we might now call cognitive reframing, but they were doing it collectively, systematically, and with a sophistication that would impress modern therapists. Take their relationship with death, for example. In a world where people died regularly from exposure, starvation, and predation, these communities developed burial practices and mourning rituals that transformed loss into a source of strength rather than despair. They weren't just disposing of bodies. They were creating elaborate ceremonies that honored the dead while reinforcing the bonds between the living. The grave goods they left with their dead tell an incredible story. Even during the harshest winters, when every resource was precious, they were still investing significant time and materials in honoring their deceased. This wasn't wasteful behavior. It was psychological necessity. They understood that how a community treats its dead directly impacts how the living feel about their own mortality and their place in the world. But here's where it gets really interesting. They weren't just dealing with death, they were preparing for it in ways that actually made them more effective at living. They developed what we might now call death acceptance practices that freed them from the paralyzing fear of mortality that can destroy decision-making and risk-taking ability. When you're not constantly terrified of dying, you can make clearer decisions about how to live. You can take calculated risks. You can invest in long-term projects. You can maintain hope even when the immediate circumstances look hopeless. This psychological freedom was perhaps their greatest survival advantage. They were also incredibly sophisticated about managing what we now call seasonal affective disorder. They understood that the long dark winters could trigger depression, anxiety, and other mental health challenges that could be just as deadly as physical threats. So they developed specific practices designed to maintain psychological well-being during the darkest months. Light management was a huge part of this. They weren't just using fire for warmth and cooking. They were using it therapeutically. They understood that the quality, timing, and intensity of light exposure could dramatically impact mood and mental clarity. They were creating lighting systems that mimicked natural seasonal patterns, using different types of flames and reflective surfaces to create environments that supported psychological health. Social rhythms were equally important. They developed daily, weekly, and seasonal routines that provided structure and predictability during times when the external world was chaotic and unpredictable. These weren't just arbitrary schedules. They were carefully designed systems that supported both individual and group psychological well-being. The work patterns they established were particularly brilliant. They understood that having meaningful work was essential for maintaining mental health during long periods of isolation, but they also understood that monotonous, repetitive work could be psychologically destructive. So they created varied, engaging work systems that gave people a sense of purpose and accomplishment while avoiding the soul-crushing boredom that can destroy morale. Tool-making, for example, wasn't just about creating functional objects. It was about engaging in creative, challenging work that exercised the mind and provided a sense of mastery and achievement. The incredible sophistication and beauty of the tools they created during winter months shows us people who weren't just surviving, they were thriving intellectually and creatively. They were also master psychologists when it came to managing group dynamics during extended isolation. They understood that cabin fever wasn't just an individual problem, it was a community threat that could destroy the social bonds that kept everyone alive. So they developed specific practices for managing interpersonal tensions, maintaining privacy within crowded spaces, and creating opportunities for both solitude and social connection. The spatial organization of their winter shelters reflects this understanding. These weren't just random living arrangements. They were carefully designed environments that balanced the need for warmth and security with the psychological need for personal space and privacy. They created semi-private areas within shared spaces, quiet zones for reflection and meditation, and common areas designed specifically for social interaction. But perhaps most impressively, they understood that maintaining psychological resilience required more than just managing negative emotions. They were actively cultivating positive emotions, even in the midst of harsh conditions. They were creating systems for generating joy, wonder, excitement, and hope during months when the external world provided little reason for optimism. The games they played weren't just time killers. They were sophisticated psychological tools designed to maintain cognitive function, social bonding, and emotional well-being. The music they created served similar functions, providing emotional release, group cohesion, and a sense of transcendence that helped people connect with something larger than their immediate circumstances. And this brings us to perhaps the most profound aspect of their psychological resilience: their relationship with the natural world itself. While modern people tend to see harsh weather as an enemy to be defeated, our ancestors developed a completely different relationship with winter. They saw it as a teacher, a partner, even a friend. This wasn't naive romanticism. It was sophisticated psychological adaptation. By reframing their relationship with winter from adversarial to collaborative, they eliminated much of the psychological stress that comes from feeling like you're fighting a losing battle against forces beyond your control. Instead of seeing themselves as victims of harsh conditions, they saw themselves as participants in a larger natural cycle that had its own wisdom and purpose. The evidence for this psychological reframing is everywhere: in their art, their burial practices, and their ritual systems. They weren't just enduring winter, they were celebrating it, learning from it, and finding meaning in their relationship with it. This allowed them to maintain not just their sanity, but their sense of wonder and curiosity about the world around them. They were also incredibly strategic about maintaining future orientation during times when the present was difficult and the immediate future looked uncertain. They weren't just focused on getting through the next day or the next week. They were actively planning and preparing for springs that were still months away, for summers that seemed impossibly distant, for future generations who hadn't even been born yet. This long-term thinking wasn't just practical, it was psychological medicine. It gave them reasons to endure present hardships and maintain their connection to hope and possibility, even when their immediate circumstances were grim. They were creating what we might now call vision boards, but they were doing it collectively and with a sophistication that modern self-help gurus are still trying to understand. The seasonal ceremonies they developed weren't just religious observances. They were psychological technologies designed to maintain connection to the larger cycles of life and death, growth and dormancy that governed their world. They were creating meaning systems that transformed their suffering from random misfortune into necessary participation in cosmic processes that were both meaningful and ultimately beneficial. But here's what really blows my mind about their psychological resilience. They weren't just maintaining their mental health individually. They were creating collective psychological systems that made the entire community more resilient than any individual could be alone. They understood that psychological well-being wasn't just a personal responsibility. It was a community project that required everyone's participation. The storytelling traditions they developed weren't just entertainment. They were collective memory systems that preserved not just practical knowledge, but emotional wisdom about how to navigate difficult times. The stories they told during winter months weren't just about heroes and adventures. They were about people who had faced similar challenges and found ways to not just survive, but grow stronger through their experiences. They were creating what we might now call support groups, but they were doing it in ways that were seamlessly integrated into their daily lives. Everyone was both a counselor and a client, both a teacher and a student, both a supporter and someone who needed support. They understood that psychological resilience wasn't a destination you reached. It was a practice you maintained through continuous mutual support and shared meaning-making. And this is where their story becomes most relevant to our modern lives. Because while we might not be facing saber-toothed tigers or mammoth hunts, we're dealing with our own forms of winter. Economic uncertainty, social isolation, environmental challenges, political chaos. These are the modern equivalents of the harsh conditions our ancestors faced, and the strategies they developed for maintaining psychological resilience in the face of overwhelming challenges are just as relevant today as they were 40,000 years ago. The difference is that they understood something we've forgotten. Resilience isn't just about individual toughness or willpower. It's about creating systems, social, psychological, and spiritual, that support not just survival, but thriving in the midst of difficulty. They weren't just getting through winter. They were using winter as an opportunity to deepen their connections, strengthen their communities, and discover capacities they didn't know they possessed. But there's one more aspect of their winter survival that we haven't talked about yet, and it might be the most important one of all, because all of these strategies, the preparation, the community systems, the psychological resilience, they were all built on a foundation that seems almost impossible to modern minds. They were built on a level of present moment awareness and environmental attunement that allowed them to read the world around them like a book that was written specifically for their survival. This wasn't just about knowing when storms were coming or where to find game. This was about developing a relationship with their environment that was so intimate, so nuanced, that they could detect changes and opportunities that would be completely invisible to modern people. They weren't just living in their environment. They were participating in it, communicating with it, learning from it in ways that transformed them from visitors in the natural world into integral parts of it. And that's where we're going next. Because understanding how they developed this level of environmental awareness isn't just fascinating from a historical perspective. It's essential knowledge for anyone who wants to develop real resilience in an uncertain world. This environmental awareness wasn't some mystical connection to nature that we've lost to modern civilization. It was a learned skill, developed through decades of careful observation and passed down through generations of accumulated wisdom. And the way they developed it reveals something profound about human potential that most of us never tap into. Think about how you navigate your daily environment. You probably know when your favorite coffee shop opens, which route to work has the least traffic, when your neighbor's dog usually starts barking. You've developed this knowledge unconsciously, through repetition and necessity. Now imagine applying that same observational capacity to literally everything around you, but with life or death stakes motivating every observation. That's what our ancestors were doing. They weren't just casually noticing their surroundings. They were developing what we might call environmental literacy at a level that would seem superhuman to modern people. They could read cloud formations like we read traffic signs. They could interpret animal behavior like we interpret social media posts. They could sense changes in air pressure, humidity, and temperature that would allow them to predict weather patterns days in advance. But here's the crucial part. This wasn't just individual skill development. They were creating collective knowledge systems that amplified everyone's observational abilities. When one person noticed something unusual about the way the birds were flying, they shared that information with the group. When someone detected a subtle change in the wind patterns, it became part of the community's decision-making process. They were functioning like a distributed sensor network, with each person contributing their unique observations to a shared understanding of their environment. The sophistication of this system becomes clear when you look at how they managed winter hunting. Modern hunters, even with all our technology, struggle to track animals in snow-covered landscapes. Our ancestors were doing it with nothing but their senses and their accumulated knowledge, and they were successful enough to feed entire communities through months-long winters. They weren't just following tracks in the snow. They were reading the entire landscape, like a three-dimensional map that told them where animals had been, where they were going, what they were doing, and what they were likely to do next. They could determine not just what species had passed through an area, but how many individuals, what their health status was, whether they were stressed or relaxed, whether they were feeding or migrating. This level of awareness extended to every aspect of their environment. They could read the forest floor like we read newspapers, extracting information about weather patterns, seasonal changes, resource availability, and potential threats from subtle signs that would be completely invisible to untrained eyes. They could detect the presence of predators from scent traces that were days old, identify edible plants in winter conditions where nothing looked obviously edible, and locate water sources in frozen landscapes where surface water was completely hidden. But perhaps most impressively, they were using this environmental awareness to predict and prepare for changes that were still weeks or months away. They weren't just reacting to immediate conditions. They were reading the early warning signs that allowed them to anticipate and prepare for future challenges. The way they tracked seasonal changes was particularly sophisticated. They understood that winter wasn't just a uniform period of cold and snow, but a complex sequence of different phases, each with its own characteristics, challenges, and opportunities. They could predict not just when winter would arrive, but what specific type of winter conditions to expect, how long each phase would last, and what resources would be available during each period. This allowed them to plan their activities with incredible precision. They knew exactly when to begin certain types of food preservation, when to start gathering specific materials for winter shelters, when to relocate to different areas based on changing resource availability. They were operating like meteorologists, ecologists, and resource managers all rolled into one, and they were passing this knowledge down through teaching systems that were far more sophisticated than anything we see in modern education. Children weren't just told about environmental patterns, they were trained to observe and interpret them firsthand. They were taught to notice subtle changes, to make connections between seemingly unrelated phenomena, and to develop the kind of intuitive understanding that comes from years of direct experience. The teaching methods they used were incredibly effective because they were experiential rather than theoretical. Children learned by doing, by participating in real survival activities, where their developing skills had immediate practical applications. They weren't memorizing facts about animal behavior. They were learning to read animal behavior by actually tracking and hunting animals alongside experienced adults. This created a knowledge base that was both incredibly deep and remarkably adaptable, because they understood the underlying principles rather than just memorizing specific facts. They could apply their knowledge to new situations, changing conditions, and unexpected challenges. They weren't just following predetermined scripts. They were improvising based on real-time environmental feedback. The psychological benefits of this environmental awareness were just as important as the practical ones. When you can read your environment accurately, you feel more confident, more prepared, and more capable of handling whatever challenges might arise. You're not just hoping for the best. You're actively gathering information that allows you to make informed decisions about your safety and survival. This sense of environmental competence was a crucial component of their psychological resilience. They weren't just enduring winter. They were actively engaging with it, learning from it, and using their understanding of it to their advantage. Winter wasn't just something that happened to them. It was something they participated in as knowledgeable, skilled partners. But the most profound aspect of their environmental awareness was how it shaped their relationship with uncertainty itself. Modern people tend to be terrified of uncertainty. because we've lost the skills to navigate it effectively. Our ancestors had developed such sophisticated environmental awareness that they could find predictability and opportunity even in apparently chaotic and dangerous conditions. They weren't eliminating uncertainty. That would have been impossible. But they were developing the skills to dance with uncertainty, to find patterns within chaos, to make good decisions even when they couldn't predict exactly what would happen next. This gave them a kind of confidence and adaptability that allowed them to thrive in conditions that would paralyze most modern people. The way they dealt with weather uncertainty is a perfect example. They couldn't predict exactly when storms would hit, or how severe they would be, but they could read the early warning signs well enough to prepare appropriately. They weren't trying to control the weather. They were developing the flexibility to respond effectively to whatever weather conditions actually materialized. This approach to uncertainty was woven into every aspect of their winter survival strategy. They weren't just preparing for one specific type of winter. They were preparing for the range of possible winter conditions they might encounter. They weren't just developing one hunting strategy. They were developing multiple strategies that could be adapted to different game availability scenarios. Their food storage systems reflected this same approach. They weren't just storing one type of food. They were creating diverse food reserves that could sustain them through various types of resource scarcity. They weren't just preserving food for a specific length of winter. They were creating storage systems that could handle winters of varying duration and severity. This flexibility was built into their social systems as well. They weren't just organizing their communities for one specific type of winter challenge. They were creating social structures that could adapt to different types of stress and opportunity. They had backup systems for their backup systems, alternative approaches for every critical survival function. The technological innovations they developed reflected the same adaptive approach. Their tools weren't just designed for one specific task. They were created to be versatile, repairable, and adaptable to changing conditions. They weren't just building shelters for one specific type of weather. They were creating living spaces that could be modified and improved based on actual conditions. This adaptive mindset was perhaps their greatest survival advantage. While other species were locked into specific behavioral patterns that worked well under certain conditions, but failed when conditions changed, humans were developing the ability to consciously modify their behavior based on changing circumstances. They weren't just surviving winter. They were learning from each winter, improving their strategies, and passing those improvements on to future generations. Each winter was both a test of their existing knowledge and an opportunity to develop new insights that would make them more effective in the future. The cumulative effect of this adaptive learning was extraordinary. Over generations, they were developing winter survival strategies that were not just effective, but continuously improving. They weren't just maintaining their knowledge base, they were expanding it, refining it, and making it more sophisticated with each passing year. This is why archaeological evidence shows us communities that weren't just surviving repeated Ice Age winters, but actually becoming more successful over time. Their later settlements show evidence of improved technology, more sophisticated social organization, and more effective resource management strategies. They weren't just enduring, they were evolving. The art they created during winter months reflects this same progressive development. The cave paintings, carvings, and decorative objects from later periods show increasing sophistication, complexity, and technical skill. They weren't just creating art to pass the time. They were using their winter downtime to develop and refine their creative abilities. This creative development wasn't separate from their survival activities. It was integrated with them. The same observational skills that helped them track animals were being applied to artistic representation. The same manual dexterity that helped them create tools was being used to create decorative objects. The same social cooperation that helped them survive was being used to create collaborative artistic projects. The psychological benefits of this creative development were enormous. Creating beautiful, meaningful objects during the darkest months of the year wasn't just entertainment, it was a way of maintaining hope, purpose, and connection to something larger than immediate survival needs. It was a way of asserting their humanity, even in the midst of harsh, dehumanizing conditions. But perhaps most importantly, their creative activities were creating shared meaning systems that bound their communities together and gave them reasons to endure hardship that went beyond mere survival. They weren't just trying to stay alive, they were trying to preserve and develop something beautiful and meaningful that could be passed on to future generations. The stories they told during winter months weren't just entertainment. They were encoding their accumulated wisdom about survival, cooperation, and meaning-making into memorable, transmissible forms. The songs they sang weren't just mood management. They were creating shared emotional experiences that reinforced social bonds and collective identity. The games they played weren't just time killers. They were practicing the skills, reflexes, and decision-making abilities that would be crucial for survival activities. The competitions they organized weren't just fun. They were maintaining physical fitness, mental sharpness, and social cohesion during months when these qualities could easily deteriorate. Everything they did during winter months was serving multiple functions simultaneously. They weren't just surviving, they were learning, growing, creating, and preparing for future challenges. They weren't just getting through winter, they were using winter as an opportunity to become more skilled, more connected, and more resilient. This multifunctional approach to winter activities was possible because they understood something fundamental about human nature that we've largely forgotten. People don't just need to survive, they need to thrive. They need meaning, purpose, growth, and connection. They need to feel like they're part of something larger than themselves, something worth preserving and developing. The survival strategies they developed weren't just about meeting basic physical needs. They were about creating conditions where human beings could flourish even in the midst of harsh circumstances. They weren't just preventing death, they were enabling life in its fullest sense. And this brings us to the most profound lesson their winter survival strategies can teach us. Resilience isn't just about toughness or endurance. It's about creating systems, physical, social, psychological, and spiritual, that don't just help you survive difficult times, but help you use those difficult times as opportunities for growth, connection, and meaning-making. The harsh winters they faced weren't just obstacles to overcome. They were teachers that forced them to develop capacities they might never have discovered under easier conditions. The challenges weren't just problems to solve. They were opportunities to deepen their understanding of themselves, their communities, and their relationship with the world around them. This is why their story is so relevant to our modern challenges. We're facing our own forms of winter, economic uncertainty, social isolation, environmental challenges, political chaos. And like our ancestors, we can choose to see these challenges as opportunities for growth, connection, and meaning-making, rather than just obstacles to endure. The strategies they developed, preparation that goes beyond stockpiling resources, community systems that ensure no one faces challenges alone, psychological resilience that finds meaning in difficulty, and environmental awareness that allows us to dance with uncertainty. These aren't just historical curiosities. They're practical tools that can help us navigate whatever challenges we're facing right now. But there's one more aspect of their winter survival that we need to explore, and it might be the most important one of all, because all of these strategies were built on a foundation that seems almost impossible to modern minds. They were built on a level of present moment awareness and embodied intelligence that allowed them to respond to challenges with a speed, accuracy, and effectiveness that would seem supernatural to people who live most of their lives in their heads. This wasn't just about being physically fit or having good reflexes. This was about developing a kind of integrated intelligence that connected mind, body, and environment in ways that maximize their survival effectiveness while minimizing their energy expenditure. They weren't just thinking their way through challenges. They were feeling their way through them, using their entire being as a sensing and responding system. And that's where their story becomes most relevant to our modern lives, because while we might not be facing saber-toothed tigers, we're dealing with challenges that require the same kind of integrated intelligence they developed. We need to be able to sense opportunities and threats that aren't obvious, to make good decisions under pressure, to respond effectively to rapidly changing conditions. The question is, how do we develop this kind of integrated intelligence in a world that seems designed to disconnect us from our bodies, our environment, and our intuitive wisdom? How do we reclaim the capacities that allowed our ancestors to not just survive, but thrive in conditions that would challenge even our most advanced modern survival experts? That's where their story stops being just about the past and starts being about the future. Because the skills they developed aren't just historical artifacts, they're human capacities that we still possess, that we can still develop, that we can still use to navigate whatever challenges we're facing right now. The fire they kept burning through the darkest nights of human history isn't just a metaphor. It's a living flame that we can still tend, still feed, still use to light our way through whatever darkness we're facing. The question isn't whether we can learn from their example. It's whether we're willing to do the work required to rekindle capacities that our modern world has taught us to forget. Because what they understood, and what we've forgotten, is that winter wasn't their enemy, it was their teacher. Every blizzard that forced them to huddle together in their mammoth bone shelters was strengthening their social bonds. Every month of preserved food rationing was teaching them the value of preparation and the art of making little go far. Every night spent carving tools by firelight was developing skills that would serve them for decades. They weren't just enduring winter, they were being forged by it. The harsh conditions weren't breaking them down, they were building them up, creating human beings who were more capable, more connected, and more resilient than they would have been without those challenges. The Ice Age wasn't happening to them, it was happening for them. This is the part that hits me hardest about their story. These people, living in conditions that would shut down our modern world, weren't just surviving, they were becoming more human, not less. The challenges that would destroy us were making them stronger, smarter, more creative, more connected to each other and to the world around them. And here's what's really wild. They were doing all of this without any of the tools we think we need to handle difficult situations. No therapy, no self-help books, no meditation apps, no life coaches, just ancient wisdom, practical skills, and an unshakable understanding that human beings are designed to thrive even in the most impossible circumstances. Their children weren't growing up weak and entitled. They were growing up to be some of the most capable, resilient, and creative humans who ever lived. They weren't being protected from difficulty. They were being prepared for it. They weren't being taught that the world owed them comfort. They were being taught that they had everything they needed to create comfort for themselves and their communities. The archaeological evidence shows us teenagers who could track animals across frozen landscapes, young adults who could build weatherproof shelters from nothing but bones and hides, elders who could predict weather patterns weeks in advance. These weren't superhuman abilities. They were normal human capacities that were developed through necessity and passed down through generations. But here's the thing that really keeps me up at night. We still have those capacities. Every single one of us carries the genetic inheritance of people who survived ice ages, who thrived in impossible conditions, who created beauty in the midst of brutality. That strength, that resilience, that creativity, that ability to find meaning in suffering and hope in darkness, it's not gone, it's just dormant. The question isn't whether we can learn from their example. The question is whether we're willing to wake up those dormant capacities, to remember what we're actually capable of when necessity demands it and community supports it. Because here's the truth. They understood that we've forgotten. Comfort isn't the goal. Growth is. Connection is. Meaning is. The ability to face whatever comes with courage, creativity, and community. The ability to find not just survival, but genuine thriving, even when the world seems to be falling apart around us. They weren't just surviving winter. They were proving that human beings are capable of so much more than we give ourselves credit for. They were demonstrating that we don't need perfect conditions to create beautiful lives. They were showing us that our greatest challenges can become our greatest teachers, if we're willing to learn from them instead of just trying to escape them. So the next time you're shivering in your apartment, complaining about the heating bill, ordering takeout because cooking feels too hard, remember this: you come from a long line of people who turned the harshest conditions on Earth into opportunities for growth, connection, and meaning. You carry their DNA, their resilience, their creativity, their unshakable belief that human beings can adapt to anything. The fire they kept burning through 40,000 years of Ice Age winters isn't just a historical curiosity. It's a living flame that still burns in you, waiting to be rekindled. The question isn't whether you can handle whatever winter you're facing right now. The question is whether you're ready to discover what you're truly capable of when you stop trying to escape your challenges and start learning from them instead. Because they didn't just survive the Ice Age, they thrived in it, and so can you.